Matthew Willox is an electronic artist. He looks punk rock. He sounds humble, yet earnest. We both work our day jobs together. We both have something to say about everything if you're serious about asking. I had no knowledge of his music career before already asking him to join me on the podcast. He is the mad scientist version of pure artistic passion and intellect, obscured by the shield of a wild salt and pepper beard. He is the musical Doc in Back to the Future. We couldn't help but skip through classic future is now digital heavy film favorites like Tron and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. The reference we missed, though, was oddly MacGyver. MacGyver was a 1985 TV show about a man who blended unconventional problem solving with deep scientific handyman skills to continually escape life or death situations without the tools or means, using whatever meager assets available and transforming them into the perfect tools for the moment. If the situation called for it, MacGyver or Matthew Willox could likely turn a DeLorean into a time machine, or an OG Super NES joystick into a keyboard. Let's just call it a little bit genius, a little bit not knowing any different. The madness in a mad scientist is the ability to continually see and hear and feel things that don't exist yet and bring them to life by any means, usually despite the lack of means. Matthew Willox is an electronic artist with over 20 releases under various monikers such as Perpetual Music Machine, Spark, Winnie the Shit, WNY, and most recently, Matter Warlocks. His music career includes the big highs of signing the record deal, winning a national laptop battle, and the deeper lows of losing everything along the way: his people, possessions, and purpose. He is a brilliant digital creator, effortlessly blending disciplines and mediums, intellect and kindness, and continues the dream of making music that will find a place. My name is Glen Erickson. This is Almost Famous Enough. Thank you for spending your time with us. This is Matthew Willox. I also super appreciate, Matthew, that you showed up with a looks like a classic SM58.
This is an SM58, and I knew you were going to say something about it.
You did? Well, I just think it's perfect. Like, there's just something so analog about who you are in your career, and then choosing the SM58. I love it. But it's good.
That's really funny that you mentioned that, because people are always like, you're the analog guy, and I'm like, no, I'm the complete opposite of that. Like, I'm this guy, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah, you're the computer chip. Yeah, you're the computer chip guy. Okay, well, I mean, that's an interesting point, because like there's a version of electronic that feels now, like we're talking 2025, right? That feels analog, and I think people mix up the terms. Is that a fair assessment? Like, they're thinking analog like the old version of blips and bleeps, the same way like analog being I'm gonna record like live off the floor into a mic of whatever comes out of this amp, and however this amp, whether it got really hot or didn't get hot that day, is gonna change the sound. Like, we talk about analog in recording, but you're an electronic music guy, so yeah, you're running things through computer chips, and I want to talk about this with you, about your fascination simply between this merger between these set of devices or tools that we use in that world and our own versions of reality, or however we might want to call it. But but I think that you started in a time when now people are sort of calling like the analog version of electronic music. Is that fair, or tell me if I'm super off base?
Okay, so way back in 1998, I think, somewhere around there, I got an email from a guy, and he's like, how are you getting your recordings so crystal clear? Like, he's like, you're recording stuff, and I'm like, I pull it up into the mixer and I crank it all the way up, and there's no noise on your recording. And so I'm like, oh, well, it's all completely digitally rendered. Like, there's no sound. Right?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have to go through the air or through any electricity. It just literally gets written to a CD, like from the memory of the computer. And
Yeah.
he's like, what? And I was like, yeah, actually, I have to add noise to stuff to make it seem more realistic. And I kind of think of it as like, on the one extreme with analog, you have all this imperfection and problems that you're trying to manage. Okay, like your cat bumping into the microphone stand, and so you have chaos, and you're trying to rein in all the chaos. And then in digital, it's like Tron World. Everything's perfect. Everything's on a grid, and you're actually trying to be like, can we add some chaos to Tron World to kind of make it more natural seeming and kind of like more human? And I kind
Yeah,
of
for
think that
people
that
not as old as you and I, Tron was a Disney smash hit of basically a human living inside of a
a computer.
computer.
That's right.
So,
Yeah,
and it
a
was
guy
brilliant.
a guy gets zapped by this gun and he gets digitized and he finds out there's like people living inside the computer. It sounds really dumb, but it's really cool. And so I really, if you look if you look at anything that I do, like from any kind of art standpoint, it's like, how do I get the computer to do noise that's real, like that feels like real chaos, feels like real mountains, or feels like real sand, or feels like a real
Mm.
tone that would really come out of something. And so there's kind of like little tricks that I've learned along the way to do that sort of thing. And I think when people start coming to me like, you're the analog guy, they're just hearing these like things that I've figured out make you think something's analog, and now I use that. It's
Mm.
tricks. It's just all tricks. It's just
Well,
all
I think
rendering
that's,
tricks.
yeah, isn't that sort of a really cool thing about, yeah, that we are so frequently trying to add these elements of reality. Well, it's just the tension, right? Like the amount of effort and money that has gone into what your guy emailed you about in 2008 of this like eternal effort to have the most perfect, clean, pristine sound, right? Like sound
Yeah.
engineers, sound snobs. I remember years ago in Edmonton on 124th Street was a place, a store called Audio Arc. It was like one of the highest end,
Yep.
like
I know it.
sound snob, the most expensive equipment,
Hi-fi
and
equipment. Yeah.
yeah, hi-fi. And I used to my first design job, I used to do the newsletters and brochures for that place. But so this eternal like pursuit of this pristine sound, and yet we've spent maybe not the same amount of money, but the same amount of effort a group of people have also spent trying to like, it's like when you get a brand new pair of white Adidas and then you scuff them on the curb on the way to school because you don't possibly want to look like you're wearing brand new shoes. Like they have to be
Kinda.
scuffed, and we do that to our music, right? Like we're scuffing the shit out of our
Yeah.
music, and I'm the same way. So I absolutely love that and identify it with, I love the real textures. I've been trying to find a quote that I placed on my Instagram a long time ago, and I'm having trouble finding it, so I apologize if I look distracted. But I had made this quote. Essentially, I'll paraphrase what the quote was, which was talking about the beauty of like the brokenness part in sound, and
Yeah.
how we end up trying to like retro, or the inclusion and the obsession with retro. And I sort of reference that with this misunderstanding of analog. The pursuit of that is really our desire and our need to sort of connect to what was that deep human element. In other words, the quote said something about, you know, the sound of a voice that's breaking because it can't contain the emotion it's trying to get out, so it cracks, or
Right.
an amp heating and overheating and breaking up led to distortion, which literally became, you know, a foundation to a guitar sound or tone that for decades now has been iterated all over the place. And
And
or the
then
tape hiss, right? Or
yep.
all
Yep.
of this stuff in recording, the tape hiss made it feel, and we use the term warm. For 2 decades, I've heard everyone say, I want it to feel warmer. And it's what they want is they want the thing that we used to think was shit. And now we want it back.
They're used to it, right? You're used to this feeling or this sound, and doesn't it kind of feel a little bit dehumanizing when the like engineer guy comes along and is like, well, that's just this, transfer curve, you know? Right? And like you have
He
these
unfortunately
conversations.
explains it for you. Yeah.
well, like, and like
Yeah.
I really would never do that to somebody, and I really try to stay out of like debates of analog versus digital, and the reason why is because once, like, if someone likes something, like, why do they have to explain it to you, right?
Mm.
Like, well, explain to me like why you like analog, and they're like, well, it's just like the sound of it. You're like, yeah, but it's not perfect, right? And now you're just the guys at the hi-fi store again trying to upsell you on something,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
Or in high
right?
fidelity, you're Jack
Yeah,
Black in high fidelity or
yeah,
something. So
yeah.
yeah.
And like, if someone came to me and was like, Matthew, like, which do you prefer, analog or digital, or like, what do you think, you know like, I like, okay, I have to pick, like, like, are we
Yeah.
talking like, is it like a $200 synthesizer I can go buy at Long and McQuaid, or is it like a Yamaha CS80 sitting in like a
Yeah.
museum somewhere? Okay, like,
Absolutely. Okay, perfect. This is exactly what I knew would happen with you, Matthew, because we could just literally rabbit hole in a second. So, quick
oh yeah,
disclaimer: Matthew Willox, we are co-workers. This is how I've met you. You're actually fairly recent to my life, and we
yeah,
get the privilege of working together. When you sent me over some information about yourself, you talked about how somebody at one point drew a picture of you staring off into a distance and your head was surrounded by musical notes and the guy didn't even know that you made music, which I thought was really fitting because I also had this immediate sense of you, not particular to music, but of like a creative. And I've been like the vice chair of the Edmonton Arts Council. I've been the chair of Alberta Music's Provincial Association. There was a year that I sat on juries and award grant funding, like all of that stuff for over 650 applicants. Like I've been so saturated with creative work, but I can count maybe on one hand, Matthew, the number of times I've met somebody and I immediately knew this is who I would define as a creative. You're one of these guys. So I knew it.
thank
It's
you.
just you have that aura, and if somebody visualized it as musical notes around a guy staring off in the distance, that's pretty cool too. So
I have
I've really
resting
enjoyed
space face. So
resting
that's my
space face. Is
yeah.
that a good acronym though? So I just knew that I thought, and then we've gotten into some conversations, and I love them all, and I thought this would be really great. So really quickly, before I end up in too many rabbit holes, I want to just paint the background because I also love your story that you provided for me and I looked into. And I love this because I didn't know your story. And the truth of it, Matthew, is like if we didn't work together, I wouldn't probably know who you are or your body of work or what this story is. And maybe that is why it feels so appealing in line with all the stories that I hope get told during the podcast.
Yeah, go for it.
And
Yeah.
the truth is, like, we can often talk to people whose stories sound like they're somewhere near a top of a mountain, and yet you've gone up and down a number of times, and
I love
it's
the
a
mountain
different
analogy.
it's a
It's
different
exactly what
side.
it is.
It's a different side of the story, and I think it's incredible also because you're a person who just walks through your day with a lot of optimism and clearly and a lot of peace, it feels like. So I hope to find a little more of how that came about. So you're, as you said, you're an I know this is like super top level to call you an
Absolutely. Yeah.
electronic musician. Obviously, there's a million
100%.
subgenres, and you've probably dipped your way through multiple ones in your time. But you started all the way back in the '90s. You already sort of referenced that. We're I think similar ages, so very developmental, crucial time of the '90s. It had a definite imprint. You probably, I'm pretty sure, the more of the people who understand the mainstream versions of that would probably recognize that a guy like Trent Reznor had a
Love
pretty
Trent
good,
Reznor.
pretty good influence on who you are and what you were making as a creative. Or bands like Skinny Puppy are probably a little more relative to a lot of people than the ones that would go down
Or
a layer.
Canadian.
Or
Yeah.
to there you go, Canadian.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you've recorded and released under several pseudonym iterations. You listed some for me. Perpetual Music Machine is what you started
Yep,
releasing under. You've done a lot over the longest span of time under the name Spark.
that's right.
My favorite is Winnie the Shit.
Yes, everyone
Clearly
loves
my
Winnie the
favorite.
Shit.
Well, yeah, it sounds so good, man.
It's so
Um,
punky. It's such a punk
it's
name.
and it's so on point. WNY. I don't know if that stands for something in
It
particular,
just stands.
but
It's just. I just see. This is a good. Like I was trying to clean up the name Winnie the Shit into
oh,
something
okay,
just a little bit, into something
okay,
just a
brilliant.
little bit nicer, right? So I'd be
So
like
you just
Winnie.
went WNY, short for Winnie.
Yeah, and
Okay,
we liked it at the
so
time. Like like I don't like it anymore. At the time, it worked.
and then the last pseudonym you use is Matter Warlocks, which you say is sort of the most recent iteration. Yes.
It's brand new, and I was trying to come up with something that connected to my name, like as a person,
Hmm.
and it did. Like it's kind of like a cliche. Actually, it's kind of a cliche when you sort of hit a certain age in electronic music and you're like, that's it, I'm like, no more names or pseudo aliases or hacker aliases, I'm just going to use my name. And I was kind of like, I don't really want to do that.
But
Like, there's nothing
but a
wrong with
little
my name.
closer. No, but
Yeah,
you were a
like,
little
yeah,
close to the name. You weren't like using the word bunny or something weird
yeah,
in your name, or yeah, you weren't.
that's right.
Yes, it totally makes
Yes.
sense.
So, and then I just kind of like, you just want something that you can kind of stick with. And it's really funny that the name Matter Warlocks kind of just makes me a little uncomfortable too, like like, and it, like, I have no explanation for it, but every time I hear it, I'm like, I like wince a little bit, like, and I'm like, hey, you know what that is? That's just me feeling vulnerable. That's me coming
Mm.
up with an idea and putting it out in front of people and them seeing it and me being like the uncomfortableness you're feeling is that you just really like it. It's okay, just like let it go, right?
Yeah, no, that's great. So, yeah, so there's like this thing about your story and your music, which is just so, I don't know what the word is, like riveting to me. Like, I feel like I want to tell people
It was
about, like, did
riveting
you know
to
this?
me.
Well,
Yeah.
good. Well, I mean, and maybe it's because I didn't know it before. I mean, there's obviously that element, and I've known you without knowing this story, and I think it's really cool. But
Yeah.
I've been able to observe different people's careers that, as we said, go up and down the mountain. But anyhow, I appreciate the time doing this. We'll like make our way through the whole thing. But your fascination primarily, I think, with the blending between the use of electronic, I'm going to say devices for lack of a better term, to create art, because for you, as you've self-described, it's not just music, it's music and visual primarily. It's some way of translating, right, things that are either happening in real time in your world and environment back into the machine and then back out to some creative expression
Yeah.
is quite an interesting cycle. And and for some people, that's all that might be, is just a version of, I like to play with these things and do this stuff. For you, it feels
Absolutely.
deeper and more philosophical, even, dare I even say maybe spiritual, if I'm guessing, that
You're
this
right on the
process,
money.
yeah, okay, that this
Yeah.
process, and that's why you're a lifer in this, which is so great. So you start
And
making
terrifying all
music,
at the same time.
and well, it is terrifying, right?
Yeah.
So you start doing all of this and exploring this right from a young age. You have like a family of sort of creative people around you that are making things and expressing. So it's an easy in, right? An easy entry point for you, and you start making stuff. But you're drawn to the electronic stuff right away. So I'm wondering,
Which was
like,
super controversial
okay,
in the inside
okay.
the in like or how about like
In the
I
Willox
remember
bubble, it was
in the Willox
controversial.
bubble, it was like, you're gonna make music on a computer? That's stupid. Like, not probably being too hard on myself, but yeah, like it's like, my uncles, and they played a lot of music. My brother played the guitar, and we
Mm.
had like a family that would really share music. And I remember listening to, I think it was like "Shine on You Crazy Diamond" by Pink Floyd, and I was like, oh, I love this like like analog synthesizer sound, which I know what all that stuff is now. But at the time, I was like,
Yep.
what is that? And, they're all like, I hate this part. you know
That's
like
crazy.
just get me to the guitars and the singing and
Yep.
the folk musicness of it, which is all great too.
Mm.
But yeah, they were like really not vehemently against it, like not like in opposition or anything like that, but like, why would you want to make this, like why would
Yeah.
you put this on a this is like Euro dance record new wave stuff? What do we want this on our Pink Floyd for, kind of thing?
I
And
in
or it's disco
1986
maybe.
in 1986 I in high school I wrote a paper in my first computer science class. So I wrote it on about MIDI, about the explosion of MIDI in 1986. And
Nice.
then and nobody, and I got like I think 100 because my teacher had no idea what any of this stuff was and couldn't tell how much I plagiarized from a Long and McQuaid magazine. But
It's
and
one of the most
but
successful technologies ever developed. Like MIDI is like one of
yeah,
the greatest pieces of technology ever.
yeah, and we had a is it the Roland Juno
Yep.
at
Like a
school,
Juno
and I was allowed to
106.
yeah, I was allowed to sign it out and bring it home, and I would just play with the like those algorithms where you just like press a key and then it would just start going, and you would change all of like the LFO and all of those, all of those things that were on a dial. But
Was
anyhow,
this the
that's a
Juno?
sidebar.
Was this the Juno 106 that they had at Vic Comp? Did they have? Was it there? Was
I
that where
wasn't
you?
at VidComp. I was in
Oh.
Saskatchewan. So this was
Oh yeah.
especially
Okay.
unheard of in the late 80s in Saskatchewan. Electronic music, things were terribly earthy then. But so you're in a family of guitar and folk guys who
So yeah, you don't really
this
notice
was
it,
your
but
punk
you're
rock.
that's right. Yeah, and you don't really notice it, but you're just around music, and you're trying to get access to the things that you want to do, and
Hmm.
but you're a kid. You know what I mean? Like it's like to your parents, like you wanting a Korg M1 so that you can go and make Push It by Salt and Pepper is basically the same thing as you wanting a Super Nintendo, right? So you're like,
Hmm.
mom, no,
Yeah,
get me one of these things, and
it's a
they're
toy.
like
Yeah.
you don't know that a Korg M1 is like $2,000 and a Super Nintendo is like 300, and the Super Nintendo is already expensive, right? So like there's no
Hmm.
way you're getting this, but you think maybe you got a shot if you like, put on your like biggest puppy dog eye and go, "Please, come on." Right? Not happening.
Yeah.
But what we did get was a computer, and very shortly afterwards internet access, like very early, through the library, um, got onto the internet. So I was basically on the internet since day one. And it's really kind of
Hmm.
funny too, because like I will see sort of different sort of waves in the internet, and I'll be like, oh yeah, we like this was like this time or whatever.
Yep.
It's like really blew my mind when the internet took off and got popular. I was like, you guys were just picking on me for being on this for like the last 10 years, you know, and now here you all are.
Yeah.
um right, right. And um like you're always on that computer, and I'm like, well, I'm looking at stuff, right? And so that actually afforded me a lot of opportunity to see a lot of things that were going on in cutting edge computing at the time. So obviously this has a lot to do with like what I ended up going into as a career, because you're around all these ideas that are basically from universities. Like the internet in the early time was like all universities connected, and all the people who were on there were like university students or like people in
Hmm.
computing. And so all the things that they were talking about was like computer stuff. Now, I'm like 14 or 15 or whatever, and I'm like, I have no idea what they're talking about, but you go and look at it and you're like, cool. Or like, hey, these guys made a game and it fits into like, the super tiny file size, and you go play that and you're like, wow. And that scene, it's called the demo scene. If you look it up, it's called the demo scene. That's where my first musical instrument, which was this tracker software, came out of. And it's basically video game music, like that's like the best way to describe it. To like, you're
Hmm.
using this like super low level technology to arrange data essentially. Like, I mean, it looks like a spreadsheet. If I showed it to you, you'd be like, how is this not just Excel? You're like, yeah. you know it kind of is like Excel, and so you're making
Excel music. That's like I've never heard that term.
yeah, and so here you have like a family of people who are beautiful. They play bass guitars, they play real guitars, they play upright bass, they have the flute, and you're like, check it out. The computer.
Bleep, bleep, bloop. Yeah.
And so it's not even like you were like the punk. It was more like you were like this troll under the bridge who was like, you can make music with computers, right? And yeah, I don't know. It just didn't click, at first. I sort of feel like I don't think it ever clicked with my dad. I still feel like maybe even to this day, like, you do work on the internet. And I'm like, yeah. It's like, what even is that? And like, well, when you check your email. Anyways, like, we could go down this rabbit hole.
I still make that joke that what are we even doing?
Yeah.
Every day.
Right.
But you moved on. Obviously it's paid off. Like we can say thankfully for everybody, it's paid off. Like Matthew and I work together. We have jobs. We somehow the geekery paid off. But so you start making music. And you sort of listed like that you put some things up on mp3.com in 98, which at that time that was like, I mean, I don't know. I always feel like I have to frame this, and maybe I don't, but it feels like that's really still birth of the internet time. Like I made my first website in 1995 and nobody knew what websites were. And mp3.com coming along is basically the immediate birth of mp3s. And so people... Those who were online, which isn't like everybody now, right? So it was still felt like a subset. They were clamoring to find everything they could find. And so that first putting things up there had a pretty positive impact for you. Is that a kind of a kickstart kind of time for you?
It is. And I had an 80 megabyte hard drive at the time. And to make an MP3, I had a program that was actually just a piece of research technology from a white paper from like some company called Fraunhofer in Germany that was the company that invented MP3. And so, you would get this thing and you could take your sound recording that was like eating up a quarter of your hard drive and like turn it into this little thing. Right? And so mp3.com became kind of like a second hard drive where I would just make the song, put it into MP3 and upload it there. And I was like, now it's on this thing. I don't need to have it on my computer anymore. It's like up there. And like, very shortly after upgraded and got a lot more stuff. But at that very initial time, that was kind of what it was to me. It was like I could finish something and put it up on this website, or even before that would be on BBSs and stuff like that. Not even as MP3s, but as like the actual mod files that I was making in the tracker. And, just was in the habit of just like making something and being like, done, up on that thing. Because it just couldn't sit around. It just didn't have the space. I didn't have like a, 3 terabyte hard drive on my computer that could just load up with like, infinity.
Yeah.
So only sort of like very shortly after that started to think of like, because it's, the website's asking you, like, put a bio picture here. Like, what's your title image look like? And I start making that stuff just because it's sort of like, you log into your little mp3.com thing and it looks empty. And you're like, okay, well, let's dress it up a little bit with some stuff. And that's where kind of like, and then I'm like, well, I need like a cool name, like actually figured that name out in this room that I'm in right now.
Really?
Like, with a dictionary. I had this huge dictionary. It was like a really old school dictionary. And, was just like literally reading every word in the dictionary going like, what can I do? And I came across Spark and I was like, that's really cool. It's short, it's punchy, it's got lots of good angles on it. I can work with that. And that was it. Away we go.
I mean, everybody, in that embryonic stage of music, there's a bunch of things at play, right? It's like you're just trying to get better. You're just trying to get good enough that people will care, maybe. And you want that validation. Then you're looking so actively for all the places you can actually get it into the people who feel about music the way you do, right? So there's a sense of looking for community. And then if any of that happens, you're also starting to feel like what are the possibilities? And so, when I look at you got to a point where you said all of a sudden it went from just releasing some of my music or putting it up there to now I'm being asked to score projects for students at MIT or music on Taekwondo CD-ROMs and producing tracks for the Oilers scoreboard, right? Or these things happening, which is like you're out of the bedroom. Like that's out of the bedroom shit, right? And that's when that's to me the first flip to another level. And then you go from up there to getting to another level of a place, right? So because I'm not familiar in electronic music, I'm wondering, in your feeling of the trajectory, what were the things that you were having to discover, to build the community and the validation, but also the opportunities where the what ifs started becoming bigger and more real for you?
Yeah. And okay, so I start doing these projects and like it's really hard to describe this because my like lead up to actually getting a tool to write music with was so long. I had already like really educated myself on what music was. Like I already had kind of like habits of critical listening and being like, what is that chord? You know what I mean? And like figuring all these different things out about music and identifying sounds and equipment that was being used to make music. Like there's a site called Hyperreal, and on there you could go and look up a song, so you could go and look up Head Like a Hole and be like, what instruments were used in making this, right? And and then it would have like samples of them. So if it was like like an Alesis, DR16 or whatever that, I can't even remember what it's called. Like it's like this like bog standard drum machine they had through the 80s and 90s. You could just be like, oh, that's the instrument that's doing that. Here's the samples of it. If I want to make drums that sound like this, just go and grab this. So by the time I started making tracks, they were already pretty good. It wasn't like I started making music and everyone around me was like, right? Like there was like a taste level there that I already had. And like, it's kind of funny. I kind of think to myself sometimes like, you came out fully forged and going to die fully forged, and like you're just kind of made out of metal. Like you're never going to change. You're never going to get better. You're never going to get worse. It's just you just are, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's actually true. Like there's like a plasticity in your brain that kind of makes it seem that way, but that's how I felt at the time. So when I started making this stuff, for CD-ROMs, and I started making stuff for the Oilers scoreboard, this was like people who were around me, friends and family who heard this stuff and were like, this guy can actually write music. Like, why don't we just get him to do it? He's a kid, right? Just, hey, we need, an hour of music for this thing. Can you do that? And you're like, sure. Right. And you just go and do it. And like, you're in such a habit of just making music and putting on something and releasing it. And I remember buying my first like CD burner and going with my dad to like CompuServe or whatever it was, the computer store that was downtown, and being like, he's like, my son needs a CD burner. And he has no idea what I'm doing or what the hell this thing is, right? And like it hooks up to the computer with like the serial port and have like, like I'm like, no, I know exactly what to do. Hook all this stuff up and burn CDs with it is great. Play them in the car. And like it was just very natural, like very organic. Like I'm making the thing. People start using that thing basically for what they're doing, right? So you kind of grow in the direction of like you are creating a creative resource, I guess, for other people. That's a kind of like a really like mechanical reductionist way of looking at it. But like people are like, hey, this is great. I'll use this in my thing. Thanks, kid.
Well, let me frame it, Matthew, against though the typical, I'll just phrase it, maybe Canadian, but maybe North American music journey, which is you're making music or art and you're trying to force everybody to come to you though, right? Like that typical story is, I got to book shows, I got to try and get gigs, I got to have people watch me, I have to get them to go to the record store and buy my music or download it, versus what you're describing as like your music is going out and becoming a part of all these things other people are doing, and it's giving you an opportunity to do more.
Yeah, and I think I always knew what the hell I was doing. Like I knew what I was doing, okay? And I always do, but I don't always know what it's for. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm going to make this thing and it needs to be XY. Like I know exactly what it's like, the vision's in my head. I see it in there. But that's pretty much it. Like once it's made, you know, what the purpose of it is that's larger than that, it makes like I just wouldn't I wouldn't even
But
occur
can
to
I
me.
ask,
Yeah.
it's never stopped you. Is that what you're saying though? Like that question has never stopped you from making it, right?
People ask me that question. Like I'll make something, you know, I've even made stuff at work and people have been like, well, what's the point of this? Right? Like,
Yeah.
why have you made this? And I'm like, I don't know. Right? I had the idea, I did it. Like once that thing is there, you know, usually when I actually, you know, put my mind to it and actually like, you know, make it, and I'm gonna make this thing.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I love it. And it feels that way for a really long time. You know, like if I make something a piece of computer art or anything, like I'll listen to it like or look at it like 10 years later and I'll be like, man, you know, this still hits the way it did the first time I made
Mm.
it. And I think that the larger purpose of things, to be honest, and maybe this is kind of an interesting way of putting it, it just never seemed like to me like I had any chance of going anywhere to do anything, you know? And I think a lot of people were telling me that at the time, you know, kid, if you don't do good in algebra, like you're gonna like end up on the street. You'll be like that guy pushing that shopping cart. And this was like the way people would communicate like my level of activities of like for school things to me. Like I was like, you know, I
Yeah.
wasn't really that great in school. I was smart. I could do well on tests, but I was like, you know, I'd get to school and be like, how
Not
soon can I get
engaged.
out of here?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Except in art classes, which I was great. Computer class, which I just like destroyed. I was like amazing at that stuff.
Yeah.
And it just, you know,
Yeah.
like obviously was just something that I had around. And, you know, I think that as I moved through those different layers up into like when somebody like when Mike Adu, who runs the record label N5MD, was my first release, he came to me and he said, hey, I want to put this song of yours that you put up on MP3.com on my label. It's going to be the first track on the first thing. And, you know, I've actually got the mini disc right
Oh,
here.
nice.
Yeah,
A mini
so
disc.
it's actually a mini disc, right?
Yeah, that's a throwback.
And they're really cool. I wish you know they'd stick around. And I know that like the idea of like sending in a press kit, like, you know, it's really funny. I do all that stuff now. Like any musical activity that you did as a teenager that you wanted to get your music known, I'm doing now as an adult. And it's like, you know, because you're like, oh, it'd be really cool to play the show. It'd be really cool to play this festival. And you know, you've got all this work behind you that you've done, but you know,
Yeah.
I feel like for whatever reason, I was, and I even feel that way in my career. It's like I was just on a trajectory that was being pushed up by a larger movement. You know, this sort of like digitalization of everything.
Yeah.
And that really catapulted me into places, just early adopter, just like going in and grabbing that first
Yeah.
technology. And I think that, you know, I still tried to do that like maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, like with stuff like, you know, it's embarrassing to even kind of bring it up, but like, you know, I'd try to make like NFTs and stuff like that. And I thought, well, this is the latest technology. This is the latest thing. This is that next bubble. This is the next kind of like wave
Yeah.
to ride essentially. And I mean, I don't really know I mean, I know that I don't like the people who run those companies. So I don't really engage with that. But, you know, that technological era might be coming to an end, you know, even with stuff like AI. It's like, how can I use AI to like, you know, promote music? Like what, I get it to make the music now? Like, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so maybe that wave is over. And, and the flip side of that is now all that stuff that you learned to do as a teenager and work as a band and promote your music, I have to learn now from scratch. After already having a career in music like that, just sort of like by grace and by effort got given to me. And really, you know, I think the tale is I didn't even know what the hell to do with it. It wasn't like there's like this really like a friend of mine, Max Willox, he's a DJ. I was playing a show with him and he comes up to me and he's like, you know, man, you had this town being Vancouver in the palm of your hand and you threw it all away. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, dude, I can barely make my rent every month. You know what I mean? It's like, if I had a whole town like Vancouver in the palm of my hand, I feel like there would be some sort of message back from that town that like, we're gonna, you know, this like,
We've
you're gonna
we've
make
got
it.
you. Yeah.
I've got you, right? And it's like there was nothing. It's like every single thing that I did, I'd always have to like, you have to put you do the work, you put the work out, and you see what comes back. And
Yeah.
if nothing comes back, you don't do anything, right? Like you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like there's that next step. And I feel like if I had had a mentor or a coach or someone who cared, like anyone who cared enough to kind of talk to me every day and be like, well, like, why don't you try this? Why don't you try this? And that's what my friend Jen Pearson was kind of like very early on in Vancouver, like, hey, come play this show. Hey, come do this. But I was already hitting the bricks before that, like giving my CDs to nightclubs and be like, hey, I play this kind of music, like, would you guys want to have me do a live set or something like that? And it was like, guy in the coffee shop's like, sure, come in next week on Thursday, play your show, right? And, like, you're already,
Yeah.
you're doing that sort of thing, and you're on a label, so that carries with it a certain kind of your reputation kind of
for you.
yeah, right. Like you're validated essentially.
Well, what you're describing, Matthew, is like this, like even back to the start of what you were saying here.
Yeah,
it made me feel like this age-old debate about art for art's sake. But really what you got into describing to me is how, you're being able to look back right now and say, I was just riding a wave, right? And this has happened a lot over musical history of, who was at the top of that wave, or at least visibly in that wave. Because when you talk to the people that became famously or significantly attached to those waves, they always talk about all the people that didn't get known, right? That were sort of the foundation for them. And I guess when I read about your stuff and I hear you say that, I feel like, do you ever feel like you were a part of a foundation, maybe that a lot of other people maybe got a little more significance or career out of, because the way they did it, maybe like what you're describing is the other tension between, I was just making the stuff, I wasn't figuring out all the other things, like the business of it, like you're having to figure out now that, my promotional work is like maybe more than 50% of the time it takes to be able to do anything with my music. And if you weren't doing that at the time when you were just creating and opportunities were coming to you because you were a part of a wave, it sounds like you're saying that maybe I missed out on things because that's all it was for me then.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think that, when someone says, hey, I want to put your music in this thing, and you're like, great, here you go.
Mm-hmm.
I make music. I'm a resource for this stuff. Come get it. When someone's like, hey, I want to put you on my label and I want it to be this song, I really love it, I'm like, go for it. Right. And I don't want to be like, I wasn't thinking of the business aspects of it, but like, let's put it this way. The business aspects of that music was like, if you were to like be like at that time, hey Matthew, what do you think you need to do as a business person to make this music, more popular? I think the answer would have just been hilariously oversimplified. And I'm like, well, I needed to get it in front of more people, right? And you're like, okay, like, how are you going to do that? Right? And I would have had absolutely no idea what to do.
But that's so common, Matthew. Like I've run
Yeah.
development programs now,
Yeah.
and that's literally, that's the early answer. That's always the same thing. They're like, how do I get this in front of more people? And they think that that's the solution.
But here's the thing though. It's like I had no excuse. I worked in marketing. I worked at a huge advertising agency. So I was just a goddamn kid. You know what I mean? Like I had no clue what the hell I was doing, right? And
Yeah.
I knew that if you got the tool into my hand and you were like, if you gave me the samurai sword and you were like, go cut that thing, no problem. Where the samurai sword came from or who the thing I'm cutting is, no clue.
Yeah.
Right. And, guys like Patrick Deedy, he was a DJ in Vancouver, Jen Pearson, who, was my friend, and they had a night, or they worked on a night called Void, and they would bring in big artists. Like they would bring in like Warp Records artists, like Plaid or Square Pusher, these people who like, in my scene of music were like the big stars. And, they were like, hey, you should play at our night, and to me, it just was like, yeah, cool, let's go have fun. And like, I'm going to go play it at a nightclub, and I make this art, and, and
Yeah.
it is seriously like, was that innocent? And I had very little opinions about why you should do it or who you should do it for. Just that, like, it was just kind of like Man, and I think like when I was a kid, I was just so lonely and so lost that I just like got into like making techno for people on the internet, and I kept doing that, and eventually they were like, "Here's a stage." Right?
Yeah.
And I think that
Yeah.
there is a real beauty to that. Like I think that, you know, when you think about that, and you know, like I hope some of my friends end up listening to this, and they hear me talk about them, because I think they did a lot for me. And I don't think, other than playing those shows, ever really had an opportunity to do anything for them. And so that kind of creates this asymmetric relationship where it's like you're taking, right, but you don't know that that's what you're doing. You're just sort of like, yeah, we're cool, we're the cool people making stuff, you know, and like here's a stage, and like
Hmm.
let's rock and roll, right? And you know, to have someone say to you like you threw it away is kind of like, what did they see? And I still don't know. And it's one of those things where, you know what I mean, and like I felt all of
Yeah.
that at that time, and that was like really weighing on me at that time, being like, what am I, why? You know, it's kind of funny to say. I think there's a part of me that wished that I was kind of like, have you ever seen Blade Runner 2049?
Yeah.
You ever seen that movie? Okay,
Yeah.
so the robot child who is like in the bubble making the dreams, and everyone comes to them and like, hey, you make the memories, and they're like completely sealed off from the world. I sort of feel like, as an artist, I wish I could have just stayed that and never really, and just people would just
Mm.
come, they would just come in and knock on the glass and be like, I need some completely fucking insane, like wild rave banger, you know, and you'd be like, cool, I'll have that to you tomorrow. Come back and get it. Right. Right. And, you know, never really had to like deal with
What's
the
that
like,
famous like genie thing where you would like put
yeah,
your quarter in and get the whatever the you know
Zophar.
so
Zophar.
far
Yeah.
I feel like you
Yeah.
want to be like this magical like electronic Zophar.
Yeah, basically. And you know, you can't be, you know, because I feel like at the end of the day,
Yeah.
everybody wants to be that. Everyone wants that. Everyone wants to be the kind of like golden boy. And like, you know, his comment that I threw it away was really funny, because like the number of tries it took to get to that show where I was playing with him was like 2 records worth of work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
giving it to them and being like, do you like this? Do you like this? And I remember there was like a burrito shop near my place called Budgie's Burritos, and I walked in there one day, and they're all in there eating burritos, like you know, a bunch of them. And I had just sent over a thing to them, and they're all like, Matthew, oh yeah, this thing you sent us, it's fucking great. Like, let's do it. You know what I mean? And I remember being like, I don't even need a burrito now. Like, I just like, I have like received this like like, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
this isn't, this is like, this is like, I have made something, or how about this? I have seen something and been like, wow, that's so inspiring. Made the thing and been like, I want to get on that stage. Given it to them, faced rejection, given it to them, received, you know, the validation from them, and then got on the show. And you know, that to me, just at that time in my life, was like just a huge victory. And you know,
Yeah.
the and you know, and so, you know, of course I just pulled the Brinks truck up and filled it up with bags of money and drove home, right? Yeah.
No. Well, let me say this, Matthew, because I think that's one of the most relatable things you could say. So it doesn't matter
Yeah.
what genre of music we're talking about, right? You just described this experience of
Yeah.
I saw this thing that inspired me.
Yeah.
And art to me, it doesn't matter what medium we're even talking about.
No.
It's I have something inside of me and I have to pull it out and make it like tactile or something. Do you know what I mean? That someone
Yep.
else can see it. Is it even real? This is why we joke about what we make on the internet. Is it even real? It's not real until somebody else can experience and see it, hopefully the way I was seeing it. And that's art, this expression. And you're just describing this experience of I saw this thing, it inspired me, and I went and I needed to make it. And maybe the first iterations weren't good, but I kept making it until it was good enough that the people who made it and inspired me saw it and felt the same way. That's what we're
Yeah.
all, that's what we've all been doing. Like I've worked with, 17-year-old country artists who just want, the amount of work they do to just be able to spin that the same way as the one who inspired them to do it. That's everything.
Yeah. And I have this really distinct memory. It was like Lida played their first sort of show, and they had like a bunch of artists who were all playing stuff. And there was an artist, Kalamalka, I can't remember exactly how to pronounce it. He was playing a show, and I remember the very beginning of his set was just like cricket sounds and like jungle ambience and like, kind of like this like bass line playing underneath it. And like like the memory is just like so vivid of that moment, and being like, you can like, if you were to talk to somebody a week previous and being like, someone was playing cricket sounds at their show, you would have been like, yeah, what? Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, why would they do, like, why would you do that? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, right? And but then painted this sort of like ambiance, and like just built on it, and layers and layers and layers of texture and bass on top of that, and it just blew my mind. Like I really couldn't even handle it. Like I walked out of there, and like I swear to God, I didn't even sleep that night, because I was just like, wow, like it's just like, I'm way off base. Like everything that I'm doing is wrong. Like, why am I doing it this way? Do you know what I mean? Like you're just in a fugue now. Like, your brain's just like,
Yeah.
right. And yeah, right. And I really like, it's really, I really think that like as I've grown as an artist, and grown, into an adult who like takes more responsibility for the things that I'm doing, I really think that when you are creating something, like coming up with a theory about what it is or how it's made, and producing it is kind of like, it's like I don't want to be like, you can manufacture inspiration for other people, because I think that is very tricky and like probably just impossible. Like it's serendipity just doesn't work that way. But if you just come up with the idea and come up with all the like little pieces for it, you kind of end up making something that will never fall apart under any circumstance. Like it'll always just sort of be rock solid. And I think that this is one of those things where we see modern art where someone tapes a banana to the wall, and we're like, it's art. And like I think what actually drives people so crazy about stuff like that is like, you have nothing to go at it with. You know what I mean? Like that idea is so pure and so completely done that it's like, you're like opening your mouth to try to criticize it is like your downfall, right? Where you're like, well, it's just a banana taped to a wall, and you're like, yeah, so tell me like why you think that's wrong.
But then
like,
the conversation right? becomes, no, it's not all the other things. It's not just a banana and tape and a wall.
That's right. Yeah.
It's the absence and the choice of, whatever we could go on about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Anyways, you sort of know what I'm saying there. Like anyways, it's continue.
Well, let me ask you this, Matthew, because this is what I like in your timeline, so to speak, for lack of a better term, but this effort of what you're going through, the iterations, the opportunities, I sort of referenced the late 90s, and even like getting to make electronic tracks for the Oilers scoreboard, right? That'd be like some version of a huge win for a young kid in Edmonton, getting out of their basement with their music. And then you get to points where you hit some number of whatever on mp3.com, or when you first are putting music out somewhere, and then you've been signed to a label. So there's that, not just that validation. Yeah, there's a validation, but that sort of respectable stance with your peers that, no one can take away from you, that like the business recognized you. You're a part of the fabric of the whole industry now. That's another level. I mean, as crazy as things, like you said, you won a national laptop battle championship in Seattle at some point, like a pretty huge deal at the time. So you've had these things which, like the label and things like that, which are very peak moments. And then you describe like multiple crashes underneath that.
Yeah.
And you sort of referenced already sort of slightly, you know, how, you know, what really drives things sometimes is like, I was just feeling lost, or I'm a lonely kid, and you're trying to fill a void. And I think this is sometimes, sometimes these stories get told in music, sometimes they don't. Just how much artists have this common thread of validation and what we're trying to fill inside of ourselves with. Like, we're not just trying to make music that makes people happy, though we all say that in our pressers.
Yeah.
We're trying to find some version of happiness, and you hear the tragic, you only hear this talked about in the tragic stories of how did success not make Cobain happy? How did Michael Hutchence not be happy with all his success in excess? But it's just, I think it's real at the most base level. And you describe a couple of burnout phases. It feels like all of these things and this like mass amount of just constantly creating and putting things out wasn't returning enough to fill that void. Is that an accurate assumption? I'm wondering if you can just tell me about your experience as an artist, not sort of getting what you need back from it to keep you solid. Yeah.
I'll give you the grown-up Matthew version first, and then we'll go back and do the like kid Matthew version. Okay. So have a really clear idea what you hope to achieve before you start doing something, which is really funny that I say that, because just earlier I was like, I make something, I have no idea why.
Yeah.
Okay. And the only reason why I say that is that if you start making something and it starts doing well, you are going to have to take responsibility for whatever is happening to you as a result of that success or whatever people are buying into, right? So if you're like, I'm going to make a sick record that has a bunch of crazy dirgy death marches on it, and then like suddenly that's like used as like some sort of campaign music for like, an invasion, you're gonna have to be like, sorry, that's not what I was just making something cool, like I didn't need it to be done for this. I don't want to get paid for something like this, right? You kind of have to take that into account. Now I know that today because I'm grown up and I've seen, I have allowed myself to not wound, irreparably, but harm people, as a result of my behavior, right? And, nothing ugly, but, just being a stupid kid acting impulsively and being a dumbass, right? And, it really kind of blows me away how we don't recognize that, like, everyone's going to get to a certain level of maturity in a different way at a different time.
Yeah.
So anyways, getting music to the Oilers scoreboard, getting music on a record label, getting into this laptop battle championship stuff were all things that if you had asked me previously, hey, let's do this, I probably would have been like, I don't really want to go do that, right? But because the opportunity just kind of showed up on your door and being like, hey, would you like some free validation for everything that you've been working on? Even though you have no clue what you're doing, I'll just put this record out for you. No big deal. You're like, yeah, let's do it, right? Sure. And so, the problem with that is that when you go and you get the result back, you didn't try to do anything for it, right? It's almost kind of like someone was like, tomorrow there's going to be a mystery present on your doorstep. Yes or no? Do you want a mystery present on your doorstep? And you open it up and it's like some sort of like weird candle that smells like O. Henry or something, and you're like, great, okay, cool, throw that on the shelf, right? And like it's not like you're getting this thing back that is fulfilling to you in any way. It's just happening to you, right? And you're sort of getting, and so you can look back on it, you're like, this is an accomplishment. We did this, and I did the work to make it happen. Like I paid a lawyer to do a record contract. I recorded the album. I produced all the art for it. You know what I mean? I talked to the record label, put this thing together. And then it goes out there and you see the reaction of the people who are, what they're saying about it or how it makes them feel. And you're like, you don't get it. Right. And, and
the thing that's coming back, you're saying, isn't necessarily what you needed.
That's right.
And maybe the real friction is that you have some sense of guilt over that or confusion because you thought it would be something else. And the public also, if you express that, thinks you're being ungrateful, maybe.
So yeah, so I think if you went and if you went and talked to Mike Adu and you said to him like, what was Matthew like when you were working on this stuff with him, he'd probably be like kind of disaffected, or like maybe overly challenging. Cause like, I was like, well, like, what are we gonna who are we playing shows with? Like, if I'm gonna put this album out, let's play some shows. Like, let's do some stuff. And it was sort of like, no, that's not really what we got going on here. Or like, oh, whoa, slow down. Like, you're thinking like, you're on this level, but you're actually on this level. And I was like, I don't care what level it is. Let's just do the thing, right? And because I'm like doing this thing, or let's say going to California and playing a show with a bunch of people who I'm making music with would be really validating, like 10 times more validating than putting any kind of record out. Even if it's like you come back in a negative in the bank account because you had to go do that, the fulfillment of that is more, right? Yeah. And so, I'm playing shows in Vancouver, or I'm going to a lot of shows, and I have a good friend group, and this laptop battle stuff comes up, and my friend Jen is like, hey, you should do this laptop battle thing. And I'm like, really? She's like, yeah, you got to do it. And like all of my friends are like, you will just annihilate this. Like there's just no contest. Trust me, you'll get into this and you'll just blow them away. And I remember being like, okay, like sure, let's do it. And like, I don't want to be like, this was a mistake, right? But I go and I play that thing, and that is exactly what happens. Okay. And so there's all these people who I know or who I'm meeting who now see me as this guy who like just dismantles people in these battles. And man, that is not me at all. I am not that person. I'm like, I'm the kind of person that's like, oh, you want to learn how to make electronic music? Cool. Come over to, like, when do you want to come over? I'll show you how to do everything. It'll take 48 hours. I got a bed in the studio. You can sleep here. Yeah. Right. And like that, I'm more interested in doing that. And then, so you win that. And then you meet the people who are doing the laptop battle stuff, and they're like, you got to come to the next one. Like, you got to go, like, we can bring you to Seattle. Let's do this kind of thing. And so you go, all right, like, I got this opportunity. Here we go. Like, let's just see where it goes, kind of thing. Again, this is a theme for me. It's like, I'm not really thinking about what's going to happen the next step down the road, or like what in that situation, in that laptop battle situation, I'm basically walking into a dragon's den. But that dragon's den to me is like sort of like, look, it's the tunnel of love. Right? It's like the dragon has gone and like, painted a tunnel of love like over his mouth, so you just walk in. Yeah. Right? And so like, right?
That's a good picture.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you're like laptop battle, right? And so I go and do that, and like I have this weird memory of like being at the national laptop battle, and I thought I lost. Like I thought I was standing in the crowd, and the guy who I was battling against was playing, and I was like, no way did anything that I make match what this guy is doing right now. Like he has in the course of this battle figured out the game and responded to me here. He's like thrown he's been released. He's like the Hulk, right? And then, so I'm like, oh, I've lost. And everyone's like, no, you've won. Like, get up there. Like, do you think?
It's like Eminem's rap battle in The Last Mile.
It's like Eminem's. Yeah. Right. Exactly. It's exactly like that. And so you're like, okay, cool. And like I have this other memory of being backstage at the laptop battle, and the promoter of the show has this like big stack of bills, like just money from that show. And he's holding it and he's looking at me. And I remember being like, all right, that's my ticket home. Like I've spent my last money just to get here. And I needed to win this to be able to like make it so that I'm not walking home from Seattle, basically. But that weekend, or like right after that show, I went and played this like little space. Right after that show, I went and played on a military base. And all of these things, like every single moment of this thing, my anxiety is like going up by like a factor of 10, because I'm not around my friends anymore. I'm around people who I don't know. I'm in situations that are like I am helping create an aggressive environment through just the music that I'm making. And no one's getting hurt, but it's very rowdy. And I'm all alone, essentially, and I feel alone. And so and so each one of these things, like if you were to go and be like, I went to Seattle and I played 3 fucking crazy shows in one weekend and it just blew everyone's mind. Everyone would be like, wow, that's really great. And you know, as an accomplishment it was, but as an experience to me was like frightening the entire time, like terrifying the entire time. And when I finally got on the bus to come home, I was listening to a song, it's by Massive Attack, called Small Time Shot Away. And it's just like very low and very droning. And I just remember feeling like I need to do something other than this. Like this was a terrible idea for me to do.
Yeah.
Happy that everything turned out the way that it did and was exciting and all that kind of stuff. And it really kind of got to this thing where it's like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just sort of saying yes to stuff. And like I don't mean like know what I'm doing, like the tangible sort of day-to-day operations of like how to get
the big picture, right?
That's right.
The big plan here?
Why am I here?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, you know, that feels like the mainstream version of that story. There's a number of them, but I don't know. It made me think of like when Radiohead lands in America after Creep and realizes that America is lumping them in to be the next big grunge band just because of the song Creep. And they're like, no, this isn't us at all. They got it all wrong. And everything the business had laid out for them didn't feel right. And you know, and like they had a pretty visceral reaction to how that was all happening. And it also makes me just think of the 10 or maybe 100x version of that on people who land on such massive stages like Kurt Cobain's story. That the misunderstanding of artists, I think, by the public is what you just described, is when it's not aligned, success doesn't matter, because what it does to you is drills giant holes in that misalignment as you as a person, right?
Well, you have
get
someone
lost more.
Like I had someone, like I got this little reputation from that kind of small laptop battle group right after this, where they're like, oh, Spark, that guy, he's just in it for the money. Like he doesn't care. And I'm like, that is so not true. And I was like,
so
the money what?
Yeah.
And like your sort of mean reaction is like, what money? You know?
Yeah.
Like, I got a bus ticket home. Woo, yeah, like just watching it, you know, let's go spend this money.
I got a reputation because I asked for the money so I could get a bus ticket home. Yeah.
Basically, right? Yeah. I asked for the winnings that you were putting here in front of me so that I could get home. Thank you for that. And so, you know, the being clear about what you're trying to do and why you want to do it and what you love about it. Now, like on that bus ride home, like I was just crying, and I remember getting home and lying down and just crying and just being like, that was just awful. And it wasn't like I got there and everyone that I met was like super inspiring. And there's people who I met like my friend Christine Kinoko in quotes Evans, wonderful person. And every time that I got to hang out with her, she would just like zing off a Buddha like one-liner to me that has stuck with me to this day. In all of our friendships together, like all the times we hung out, there's probably like we've said 2,000 words to each other, but some of those words, like I'm playing a show and everyone's angry, like everyone's angry at the show I was playing one time, and it was called Smiletronic, so it was really ironic, and everyone's fighting with me. and she just comes up to me and she's like, you can't be a rainbow shitting unicorn every day. And I remember just being like, yeah. And I say that, like, I give that advice to other people all the time. Like when they're like, you know, like I just can't come into work today because I just can't do the socialization thing. And I'm like, hey man, you can't be a rainbow shitting unicorn every day. Like you just, yeah. And the other one too, and this one really speaks to me, is like, don't confuse commodification with mastery, which is like, just because you are on a stage, just because people are cheering you on or buying your record, doesn't mean that you don't have more growth in, like, there's more to do. And it's like, I wish I could go back in time, and say to someone like Kurt Cobain, like, put the shotgun down, let's make a beat on this drum machine.
Yeah.
and we're gonna,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And we're gonna reinvent you as Beck, right? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
people are gonna be
I
like,
know what you're
"What?"
saying though. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of intense, man. I mean, we've referenced Kurt a couple times and I with no pre-thought, but and it's very
Well, I'm from the
intense, but
'90s, so yeah.
it's very true, but I mean, it's just the most exaggerated story of, I think, this thing about an artist who's
Hmm.
just trying to make the thing they love and experiences misalignment. And then you throw that into the soup of whatever you're coming out of your childhood with, whatever way you've learned to cope or deal, right, with validation or the absence of it, or there's all kinds of things in the soup. So it just gets pretty intense, and I guess it's just really understood and misunderstood, I mean, in artists. So I think the way you've articulated that is really incredible based on your experience. For sake of time, because I think I could talk to you for like 3 hours and not even notice it here.
No worries.
There's a couple things I want to ask you about really quick, more rapid fire then. So I love that you referenced Tron. I had
Yep.
this early exposure into, the person is in the computer, and I was fascinated with computers as a kid. So the Tron and just the visuals of it were incredible. The video games were incredible. I used to go to the arcades in West Edmonton Mall and play Tron till I had no money left.
It's beautiful.
My
beautiful.
next, you can sort of do a big jump arc line to the
Yeah.
next one that is in my canon of favorite movies of all time, which is Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which
Okay.
felt a similar but different. And I want to know whether it's not electronic, but if you feel like that, would you see it the same way, or are you super familiar with the movie Scott Pilgrim versus
Yes,
the
I am.
World?
That's
and
like-
that
that's,
sort of that video game integration.
Yes. Oh, I have the video game. Like, so it started off as a manga or I guess just a regular. It might be in manga format.
Yeah.
And then turned into a movie, and then it's also a game. And so, yeah, I mean, the whole the whole like Ramona Flowers, like kind of like purple or red haired video game
Yep.
girl,
Yep.
right? That that we're sort of like all in love with, the cool girl. Totally get that. And that's actually kind of like the most successful album that I ever made was this album called Robotic Girl Next Door, and it is like kind of about me meeting my Ramona Flowers, like essentially.
Oh, there you go.
Right? And and like like that sort of romance is just coded into that album, like everything that we were kind of going through. Like there's this song on that album called We Almost Didn't Make It, and I wrote that song after we were like eating at like what's that it's like a vegetarian cafe on White. I can't remember what it's called.
Mosaics?
Uh,
Cafe Mosaics?
we're eating at Cafe Mosaics or some version of Cafe Mosaics, like in whatever it was in 2001. And we start walking home, and it like we go there and it's like +10, but when we leave, it's like -10. And so we're walking from White Ave across the high level bridge back to my place on like 113th and Jasper, and we're like freezing, and we're like both like we're gonna die, and we're too young and broke to like get money for a taxi cab.
You're the
right?
the Michael Cera in this
I'm Michael Cera in this
episode.
absolutely. Yeah. Like that song is just that, like, when you're trying to hang on is actually very static. You know what I mean? Like you're like there isn't like a lot of movement in a song like that. And so I just had this kind of like one kind of like pulsating idea, and people like ended up really liking that song. They're like, oh, this is like my favorite song on the record. It's just, you can really feel this kind of vibe in there. And I was like, that is like a true moment that happened to me. And so, that's like, again, when I have the vision and I know what I'm doing and I make the thing, it always turns out great. Or like, not always, but like, like I'll make it great, whatever I can do. So the idea is always there, and the execution kind of comes through. Anyways. Yeah. So that's how I feel about,
I love that.
Yeah. Like definitely video games. Yeah. Okay.
So,
Continue.
okay, well,
Excellent.
let's keep going off that, because there's another thing I wanted to quickly ask you about before we wrap up,
Sure.
which is, I think one of the most coolest things I saw from you is turning the controller of an old SNES thing into basically a musical instrument, and how you've sort of merged this, I'm making music out of my video game So Can you just give a quick, like, how did that how did that happen for you? How did you figure that out? Where was the inspiration?
Yeah, so I think at the fundamental level, there's very little difference between like a MIDI keyboard that you would plug into the computer and a Nintendo controller, right? Like you're pushing a button down, it's telling a little controller to generate a signal and sends it to the computer. So,
Yeah.
at some point you're like, hey, I'm going to go spend whatever $500 on a MIDI controller, or I can try to get my Super Nintendo controller to work. And so there's a lot of things that I used to have a Palm Pilot. You remember Palm Pilot?
Yep.
I had
Yep.
converted my Palm Pilot into a MIDI sequencer. And so I could actually, like, all my sequences for a gig were like on the Palm Pilot, and I could just pull it up and play it. Right?
That's amazing.
And so, yeah, like, and to me, it's like, I have the Palm Pilot, I can solder, and I can kind of figure out, like, what I can get out of this thing. And there's other people working on that stuff too, right? There's a community, an ecosystem. I'm not like inventing all this stuff from scratch. And so you can take that stuff and use it. And then, there's a great video on YouTube where a guy takes a bicycle and he makes it so that when you turn it one way or another, it turns the opposite way. So like if you turn left, the tire goes right, and if you turn right, the tire goes left. Okay. And so then he tries to ride it. Okay. So I sort of think that, like, if I pick up a guitar, I can get something nice out of it. If I pick up a clarinet, I can get something nice out of it. If I play on the piano, I can like, I know the piano the best, so no problem there. So if I pick up the Super Nintendo controller, aren't I just kind of trying to get that bicycle wheel to turn in the right direction? And it's just a matter of kind of like getting the brain to figure out the inputs and outputs. And it's really no more complicated than that. And it looks cool and people get all excited about it. And you're like, this is like wearing a leather studded jacket to the nerds, Like they're just like, wow, I can't believe it, and you've got it.
You showed up with a leather jacket to the nerd convention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like you're on stage and you don't got a tie on. You've got like a Super Nintendo controller that you pull out of your pocket and you start hitting it, and people are just like, what?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
What I find fascinating is when you reference this and how you've used your brain to figure this out and almost made that your brand almost of how you approach music. It goes all the way back to the start of our conversation of, we make stuff digitally and then we go and add all this analog stuff on top so it feels real or something. Or the brilliance of, distortion is that it's actually the sound of an amp that can't contain the sound. And there's something so human and real about that.
You're hitting the limits of the box.
You're hitting the limits. And the same way that you're sort of manipulating, this is what I'm fascinated. I wanted you to explain how you do that, because what's fascinating to me is I think I'm pretty smart in this stuff, and I don't get where your brain goes. I don't do the math ahead of time to think of this is just this, and I can find the sequence that connects the two, right? That I can push music through a thing that none of us thought was meant for music. I just think that's really brilliant, fascinating version of creativity.
And, well, thanks for thinking that's brilliant. I really work hard on music theory. It's something that I don't necessarily try to push on other people, but I think that understanding music theory is probably one of the most important things you can do as a musician. So I do a lot of thinking about the music theory part of it. I don't know if I can know how to answer this question. My brain just works that way. Like, I look at the numbers, I look at the relationships between notes. I have had big conversations with people where you're like, don't worry about scale, don't worry about chords, don't, like, all those things are kind of like macro structures. If you look at a skyscraper, you're like, it's a rectangle. You're like, yeah, it looks like a rectangle, but it's made up of all these other little things. And so music, to me, like the foundation of music, and it's the thing that I wish in music school and in music books they would just spend 99.9% of the book on, because it would make everything else irrelevant, is intervals between notes. All music comes down to intervals between notes. And if you, like, I used to have a friend, he would be like, how do you make the melodies that you make? Like, teach me what you're doing. And I'm like, okay, pick 7 notes on the keyboard. So go from like, pick a root note and then any 7 notes in between those two things. And he's like, well, that's weird. Like, this sounds weird or that sounds weird. And I'm like, yeah, but that's a scale. Any 7 notes between here and there is a scale. And you can actually do 8 notes. There's actually composers out there who are like, no, you can make your notes up of 8 scales. And they actually have a lot of advantages in doing it that way. And I remember showing my dad one day, he's like, well, show me how you write a song. And I literally took the sequencer and I just put a bunch of random notes in it. And I hit play and he's like, well, that sounds terrible. And I was like, well, let's take a couple notes out. And so I just plucked a couple of notes off the grid and played it again. And it started to have like a little groove in it, like, because you're creating rests, you're creating blank spaces. And he's like, oh, that's sounding better. And then I was like, well, this note needs to go up and this note needs to go down. And then, we just kind of like took that jumble of sticks that I threw in there and kind of mushed them around until we finally had like a melody and a sequence. And the biggest writer's block I ever had was probably between 2014 and last year or the year before, 2022. And I just wasn't writing any music. And it was because I was trying to like be like, well, no, like, what is the real way to write music? And you're just like, don't worry about it. It's like, who cares? If you like it, it's good. You like it, it's good. That's it. You don't need to be like, yeah, but is someone else going to really like see that I've been really original here? Like that, once that gets into my head, I'm dead. Yeah. Like I will just cease to exist.
Well, I mean, follow your heart between the intervals sounds like a pretty good theme to this entire arc of your story, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. And it's so funny that you say that now, because like my whole approach, which is like, I don't know what the next step is. And so I'm also saying my root theory is like, just use intervals. Just worry about the next step between the note.
This has been a total blast. I love talking to you about all this kind of stuff, and I know I could talk to you a whole bunch more, and I'm sure we will. But I'm going to go back and listen and try to pull a couple of those quotes from your friend out from sure. But now I'm going to walk away thinking about this whole idea of following your heart between the intervals. So thanks for all of the bits that you've given me today and for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm a huge fan of what you've done so far. Like I love listening to this show. So when you're like, you can be on my show, and I'd only like really listen to one episode at that point, I was like, yeah.
Well, that's very kind of you. I really appreciate it. I didn't want it to feel like a backhanded compliment to say you didn't have some version of fame that maybe my normal audience would quote unquote know who you were. But this is why it was so important to me, was because I think that your story is just an everyday, every person story, and I love it. It's fascinating to me, and I appreciate you just taking the time to sort of pull the veil back on it for me.
Well, can I end on one story? We'll just leap out right after this. I'll tell one story.
Sure,
so after my music career, sort of as it was, as we were talking about, had been completely and utterly destroyed by like multiple factors, and I moved back to Edmonton. I'm staying with a friend of the robotic girl next door, and I'm in his like sort of listening room. And, like my whole world's like gone, like I've lost everything, like literally everything. And I look up at his CD shelf and I see a copy of my album in there. And I pull it out and I was like, you have this? He's like, that's you? Right?
That's so on point. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And you're like, yep.
That's exactly what it is.
I feel like I've had my own almost famous enough. Like I've been almost famous enough. It's true.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that. I appreciate that very much, Matthew. I wish you obviously all the success in whatever you're doing, and I hope that I get to be inside this circle and continue to see your creative efforts. Thank you, man.
No problem. Bye.
Take care, bud.
Hey, I'm Alexi. Stick around for post fame with me and my dad. Hey, just wait, let me close my door.
You ready to go? You want to chat?
Yeah, always.
Are we going to chat?
Are we going to chat?
Okay, we're going to chat. Okay, so episode 11, Matthew Willox.
Someone I don't know.
Okay, maybe it's completely obvious, right? Like I came right out of the gates starting a podcast, and of course I'm just going to lean on my friends and people I know. The people that I know will respond to emails right away tended to be the people who got in on the guest list right away.
But you didn't ask him, did
that's
you?
Not totally true.
Did he come to you?
Well, no, we work together, right?
Yes, but how
So
did that
Matthew
come
and I work
about?
together. Well, here's the very interesting thing, and this is part of what I wrote for the intro to this. So I kind of dropped this hint in the
Hmm.
intro to the episode, so it kind of already happened. But I asked him to be a guest before I had even dug into his music career,
Okay, so you took a gamble
if you can
because it could
believe.
have been boring.
I t- I took a real swing off of this, but it's because what I sort of mentioned at the start of the
Him being a
conversation with
creative.
Matthew, which was the level to which he is a
Yeah.
creative is so unmatched with most people I met, and I can always tell through all of our conversations that everything is so
Hmm.
informed by a deep, rich experience, and I just knew that I needed and wanted something different, right? I don't
Yeah.
want the same version of a story in the music and career and the way that his we didn't really even dip into the way it overlaps just into his career and life as an
Yeah.
incredible digital artist and programmer and coder and all the things that he can do, but they are blended for him, and it was incredible. And then when I dug into his life, I couldn't find very much. I mean, the inside little note to that is he's very fun at work because he's been a great supporter too. So I asked him this very early on, and then he started listening to episodes, and then I would get Slack messages from Matthew every
That's so
Thursday when
sweet.
a new episode would come out, and he would tell me which part of the story he's relating to every time. So he's, yeah, sweet is a great
Dropping
word
in.
for it. He's just a sweet guy.
I actually take it back. I don't think he is a gamble because if you like previously knew him pre like podcast talk, like listening to him, I feel like he could be saying boring, like he could have boring content. He could be like a have a boring story, but the way he speaks and the way he engages and his little chuckle, like it would be still interesting and engaging to listen to. So I mean, if you knew him and heard that already, it's not really a gamble. Like like for a podcast where people are just listening to him talk, it's gonna be engaging. I think it just
Yeah,
makes it even better that way.
yeah, I totally agree. But I told you that I hoped you would really like his little chuckle.
Yeah,
So I'm glad that
it
you,
was so good.
yeah,
I feel the same whenever I'm talking to people. If I ever say anything and I'm either like really comfortable and like finding myself funny or opposite end and I'm like quite uncomfortable, I feel like I often do the same thing. So that was very relatable.
yeah. And the other sweet thing about him is that he can talk with great earnestness and
Yeah.
intensity, and yet it doesn't matter what the subject matter is. He can roll it off in that
Hmm.
self-deprecating, don't take himself too seriously
Yeah.
ever little chuckle at whatever part of the story. So yeah, I really love that about him, and I'm so happy to be able to share that with everybody else. So it was a different kind of story, but I loved that he's had this version, and it's, sorry, I should say, and it's a story that, like I said, isn't
Typical.
the path that a lot of my peers or that I was involved in. So it's great. And yet there's like all kinds of similarities. He had such, the aspirations and the opportunity, sort of the endless
Yeah, I
opportunity
think
in front of
opportunity is a
him.
really good word for that
And that,
podcast.
yeah, and then a big crash too in his life. But, he just said so many on point things. So my favorite thing at the very end, I don't know if you have a favorite part or thing that was said or any little segment, I'll let you say. But my favorite was just right at the end when he was just talking about music
Hmm.
theory, just randomly off to the
Yeah.
side. And he talked about the between the
Yes.
intervals where he really thinks music
That was what I
is,
was gonna say.
because scales are scales,
Yeah.
like they're there, right? Like they
They're
don't change,
predetermined.
but it's all the stuff in
Yeah.
between. And the way it just was such a clear metaphor for
Yeah.
everything he had talked about in his life
Well,
anyhow.
I was gonna say even
Yeah,
in him pointing that out, and then like you could tell he brought it up as like a quick side note to add to his point, and then he kind of fell into his own rabbit
yeah,
hole. But like the extent of like passion that he brought into just like all of a sudden talking about like intervals and like the story with his dad and like his creation process, like just that quick bit, I was like, if you just took that and had someone listen, like you can tell from that how creative of a mind he has. And like right off the bat, you describe
yeah.
him in the episode as like just such a creative person. And that drawing of him looking out into the distance he was talking about with like music notes around his head. And I'm like,
It
and he was
makes
like, that's
sense.
so weird that that person did that, but like, I guess. And I'm like, dude, if I listened to that
Yeah,
segment of him talking about like that with his dad and just making like music that way and like creating that way, like, no crap, that's what someone sees him as. Like, that's exactly an accurate portrayal. And I was like, that's so funny.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely. Okay, so I really hope people really take the time with this one because I think when you follow the way he weaves and weaves and weaves around his points with the context and the
it's so
story,
good.
like you had pointed out, it's like really sweet
Yeah.
stuff in there. What I wanted to make clear, because at one point early on, and I think I told you I might have even edited some of it because I rambled while he was talking near the beginning, trying to find a quote, and it's
Yes.
one of my
On your Instagram.
favorite quotes absolutely ever, way back in my Instagram. And then I finally pulled one part of it a little bit out near the end because it came back around to reference, and I like callbacks a
Yes.
lot. So, but if it's okay, I thought I would just read the whole quote and then you can just tell me what
Well,
you
I was gonna
think.
ask you to anyways. I was
Um,
like, you left us all on a little bit of a
okay,
cliffhanger, so
okay. Well, let's just do that. So it's from a guy named Brian Eno. He's an amazing producer, a vast array of credits, but most people know him because he was a part of the production team that was a part of U2 when
okay.
U2 really became the biggest band in the
Yeah.
world between the 80s and the 90s. So Brian Eno has been known as very revolutionary also in the electronic world, which is why I thought it was apropos
Yeah.
to Matthew. But that's not even why I thought of it. I thought of it because of the quote. So he says this: whatever you now find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty about a new medium will surely become its signature. CD distortion, the jitteriness of digital video, the crap sound of an 8-bit, all of these will be cherished and emulated as soon as they can be avoided.
Mm,
It's the sound of failure, the sound of things going out of control, of a medium pushing to its limits and breaking apart. The distorted guitar sound is the sound of something too loud for the medium that's supposed to carry it. The blues singer with the cracked voice is the sound of an emotional cry too powerful for the throat that releases it, which I just find the most articulate way of putting together this idea that we have this perfectionism as
mm-hmm.
humans. And I see it especially in like electronic music because he was talking about how that one guy said, how do you get your sound so perfectly clear back in the 90s? And he's like, because it's all digital.
Yeah.
Like I don't have to deal with the natural stuff that's here. It's just
Yeah.
digital. And that's where that conversation started from.
Like
But
his example of like him using digital and people being so impressed that it sounds so clear, and then him going and adding like background noise to make it sound like real and authentic. It's like exactly
yeah,
like what you just said. It's like he has this amazing quality now, which was new at the time, and it's like impressive, but he still just like wants that authenticness and authentic sound.
yeah,
And I just find that so interesting. Like, you would think someone
yeah,
had this like pure sound and was like, "Oh, this is great. This is lovely. I'm gonna stick to this." But it's like that
yeah.
craving for like authenticness.
Yeah. And I think the other part of that I loved about him and how he does things and what his story is and how it relates to what I find really desirable and attractive
Hmm.
in the music world it's this idea that we tend to thrive when we have less means, when we
Hmm.
have less around us. Like we tend to put out better art and work when we're in the absence of plenty. I was actually just talking about this last week with somebody about music scenes
Hmm.
in different cities. And I said there's this really common characteristic, especially here in Canada, of scenes that have developed in places where you think they wouldn't because all the local music venues shut and now people don't have anywhere maybe to play and they don't have opportunity or they're very isolated
Yeah.
in a region, right? It takes like you have to drive a long way to go play anywhere but your
Yeah.
own town. So, but those limitations
Drive.
create a greater hunger and drive. Yeah. And so better art gets produced and then all of a sudden you see what we were talking about last week with someone was I watched this thing happen in Vancouver, 15 years ago
Hmm.
or so where a lot of the famous music venues shut. They all became dance bars. And for the first time in a long time, that's when Vancouver all of a sudden, that's what Dan Mangan came out of. The scene that
Yeah.
flourished out of that came right after that, right? And because artists will go and find a way to make it happen. And Matthew was a great example that he can make, if you left him with no musical instruments, he would do like what he did, which is take a Super Nintendo controller, figure out how it's transmitting its 8 bits and turn it into something that could create sounds.
It's so cool.
Yeah, he's the mad scientist, he's the genius wizard, all of those things.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that was pretty cool. Okay, well, thank you for your time, and I hope that your work goes well tonight. If you have, I don't know, you probably don't have work left to do. Are you done your work for the night? Did I get you at the end
of my night? Yep. It's 8:30. It's bedtime.
Okay. You're such an old lady. Okay.
It happens.
Kidding. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, excited for next week.
Excited for next week too.
Okay, bye.